Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Claire Curran.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to speak to this bill in the second reading with pleasure. This is an example of a select committee in this House, in this Parliament, doing its job and ensuring that it's putting in place solid legislation. And believe me, Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation is pretty solid. It would probably be one of the most solid pieces of legislation in physical terms that have passed through this House. I'd like to know if there's another bill that actually is bigger, and if so, how long it took to get through the Select Committee process. Before I go on, I'd like to actually acknowledge all of my colleagues across the House who sat on the Select Committee, particularly from the National Party and my colleagues on the Labour Party who did the grunt work at the Select Committee, and certainly the officials who did an extraordinary amount of work on this bill. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like it noted that I don't say that about every piece of legislation that comes before this House that I have had some input into. But I must say that there was an extraordinary amount of work that went into it. And I think it's also important that we have a look at where this bill came from and what led to it. And it may have taken a long time to get to this House, probably too long, but it did come from the work that was done by the previous Labour government, which set up that financial markets reform process. And I will say that every time I speak on one of these bills in the House, because that was the genesis of the work that has been done that has brought this bill before us today. And despite the fact that it's not being supported by the Green Party, which I think is a great shame, because no bill is perfect. No bill is perfect, and certainly there were things that probably could have been improved. But it's a damn sight more of an improvement than what has been the case in this country for far too long. And as my colleague David Cunliffe said earlier, we must remain vigilant, and we certainly must. And if we didn't pass this bill in this House, hopefully in the next week or so, what would we be doing to address the major issues that have led to those 61 financial companies collapsing in this country, and the thousands and thousands of ordinary New Zealanders who have had their lives disrupted in such terrible ways? Going back to that financial markets reform process that happened under the previous Labour government, my colleague Leanne Dalzell, she set up the Capital Markets Development Task Force in 2008. Now that's 5 years ago. It's a long time for this to get to this point, to develop that blueprint and action plan for the development of our financial system. Out of that, even under a national government, Mr. Speaker, in the last term of Parliament, the Commerce Select Committee did an awful lot of work conducting an inquiry into those financial company collapses. So we have seen these people, these thousands of New Zealanders who have been so badly affected. We've seen them come before that committee. We've seen the whites of their eyes. We've seen the tears in their eyes as they told us the effects that it had on them. And one of the effects, and one of the things that I do want to address, which is in this bill, is the criminal liability regime that's been put in place, which is an enormous step forward. It may not have gone far enough. In fact, we've argued that it hasn't gone far enough. My colleagues Leanne Dalzell and Charles Chevelle have recently said that people who are convicted of offences like burglary tend to be treated much more harshly than those who destroy huge amounts of wealth through reckless and dishonest business practices. Through this piece of legislation, what we need to see is the people who are behaving in such terrible ways, the white-collar criminals who have been getting away with the practices that have led to these collapses, that they no longer get away with it, and that we do see them not only being fined those extensive amounts of money, but that we do see some people being taken before the court and sent to prison as a result of it. That will be what is the deterrent for these sorts of practices. So, Mr. Speaker, I would like to, while this bill replaces a number of pieces of legislation, including that Securities Act, the Securities Market Act, the Unit Trusts Act, the Superannuation Schemes Act and the non-tax part of the KiwiSaver Act, there is an enormous amount of detail in this bill. I want to talk about one particular part of it, which is around that liability regime, the criminal liability, where that key change in the bill is to make the offerers of products and the directors of companies criminally liable for inaccurate statements about products and disclosure documents. Now, this, there has to be fairness in every piece of legislation. I think everybody would agree with that. And therefore, in order to prove that, the Crown would have to prove a guilty mind. But the fact is that and this was an issue very dear to my heart in discussing this bill, one of the things that we have heard from those people that came before us in the financial services collapses inquiry was that it was the people fronting these companies, the people who went on television and vouched for these companies, that were basically providing a trust in people who were making these investments. They were trusting in these people because they were so-called respected members of our community, they were celebrities, they were people who were promoting the companies, and therefore they were getting the investments. I wanted to be reassured that those people would also be accountable. They would also be accountable. They may be getting a large amount of money for getting up before a TV camera for a television advertisement and saying, this is a great company, you should invest your money in it, and then being able to get away with it if that company collapsed. I wanted to be reassured that that wouldn't be the case, because it was that kind of advertisement that was leading people to make these investments. Well, that is in this piece of legislation. It may not be immediately apparent to someone who's wading through it, but it is in this piece of legislation, and it's incumbent on people, celebrities, former politicians, whoever who get up and work for these, take money from these financial companies, that they should know that they are also liable should they make false promotional statements about the veracity of the information that they're providing to the public and about the brand that they develop for these companies. So, Mr. Speaker, that is one of the critical aspects of this bill for me, and that's because the interface between the public, the mum and dad investors, the ordinary people of New Zealand who are investing in these companies, and the directors of these companies, the people who should ultimately be held accountable, are often the people who get up and use their name, their celebrity status to actually promote it. There's many other parts to this legislation. No doubt as we get through the committee stage, we'll be able to get into the detail of it. There's about 13 main changes that have been made in this bill going through the Select Committee. It's important that the public of New Zealand know it exists, because the other major issue, Mr. Speaker, is financial literacy, and the fact that people also have a need to improve their financial literacy, to understand what they're actually investing in. But this side of the House certainly does support this bill. We know that it's not perfect, but we think it's a very important improvement on what hasn't been there before. We want to see the accountability in the courts for some of these practices, but I commend this bill to the House.
I call the honourable member Mark Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's a pleasure